What's up, guys? Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over basically smoothing out everything that was in this game in the past that we hadn't covered. And I also want to go over, and the main topic of this episode, which is applying different hitboxes or collision boxes to weapons so that you can actually perform damage when the weapon hits the opponent as opposed to, for example, my fist. Because in the past we had logic for combat, but the combat was only related to the punch itself. So now we've made it to where if you're holding a weapon, your fist doesn't actually do any damage, but only the weapon does. Now, in the future, we're going to need to change the animation we have for each weapon. In fact, we might change the entire state machine we have for different types of weapons. That way, when you're holding the sword, it looks completely different, and I can attack differently. You saw how hard it was for me to actually land a hit with the sword against the pumpkin golem. So we're going to fix up some issues. Basically, we're going to fix up all the remaining issues we have in our game from our older systems. But that way we can continue moving forward. And we're going to add a specific collision for each attack. Next episode, we'll be going over playing specific state machines or animations for, depending on what weapon you're holding, and different things like that. So, let's get started. I believe this is episode 20. So if you want to catch up to the series, feel free to click these links in the top right in the iCards. One will bring you back to the start of the playlist, and one will catch you up with the inventory system, which is just something that I think is important for this episode. It's not technically required, however, it will be required to match exactly what you see on screen, and I think it's one of the harder systems we've implemented. Alright, guys. So first things first, let's fix up some stuff with our character that we had in the past. So we had it to where our idle and walk were different states, but we used blend spaces and blend poses, so we mixed them into one, idle and walking. We have this blend space 2D, and I can actually go to it. That's not the blend space 2D. This is the blend space 2D. The movement blend space. So I have things attached to my character for attaching equipment purposes, but they're really not necessary here. And you can see as we move different directions, the character also moves different directions. Now, this is good. We had different stuff in our anim BP though. We had a different state called move which handled this, but that doesn't really do what we want to do when we have all this stuff going on. So let's look at our new state machine. You can see I've changed it quite a bit. I've removed the move state altogether, and I left the idle state. Essentially what I did is I replaced the move blend space in the move state to the idle state. So we're going to rename this state right here and make it much cleaner. Idle, move. I think move works. I mean, it's walk, run, everything, right, in this blend space. That's what you just saw in here. All this stuff. Alright? With character direction and speed. So that's one thing. I've removed move entirely, and now we can do things a little bit cleaner, because since we made that change, we can now simply jump more easily. We didn't have transitions from move to jump and different things, so if you were walking and you jumped, you'd actually stay in your walking state, which looked ugly. We had running as separate, and we actually go there automatically because of our character speed, and I don't want that any longer. So what I'm going to do is disconnect my transition from move to run. We'll add a sprint later where we can actually trigger that run, but for now I'm going to remove that. It'll give you a warning, so if you'd like, you could take it out entirely to avoid the warning. But now, you're going to see my walking goes strictly off the blend space that we have with the direction, and yet I can still jump and instantly go into that state. So this is a very minor fix, but it makes all the difference. Again, before we were trying to blend between 3 different states when we had, different character speeds, and we had to have all of them go to jump and things. There's no reason for all that. So now we have a pretty clean walking system. About as clean as we can have it right now. There's definitely more that needs to be done with rotating and different things like that. but it looks pretty good. It's definitely playable at the moment. So that's just a little thing, but I thought it was important. Just remnants from the past when we didn't have blend spaces, and I figured it was time to clean it up. There's one other thing I want to cover before we get into today's main topic, which is our punching logic. So our punching logic is also a little bit bad. Currently, what it does is when we press the button, a Boolean gets set and says, hey, we have, we've punched. We've performed this action. But the problem is we weren't checking to see if, the player continued to press the button or if they had the ability to punch again. So what would happen is if you punched and it collided, we have a right-hand collider on our character. Okay, we have this right-hand collision. I think it's a sphere collision, is what they call it. And the sphere collision, if it begins overlap with the enemy, we were dealing damage. We technically were checking to see if we had a current weapon and then using that damage as well, but I've disconnected that. Only if we don't have a current weapon do I do this logic. And that makes sense, right? Because if you have a weapon, we want to use the weapons hitbox instead of just our random fist. Like, if you're using an attack and you punch someone, if you swing your sword and your fist happens to hit them, you probably don't want to deal the damage from the fist. You probably only want to do it from the sword slash. So I've disconnected this. And if you followed the series exactly, you'll know what this is, this current weapon. So you can just disconnect this is valid part. You can delete these nodes as well, if you'd like. They don't need to be here. So you can have it look like this. I just don't want to delete everything and make it confusing on you. Base character BP, on component begin overlap with the right hand collision. Also important to note, we had on component hit in the past. I've changed it to on component begin overlap. It doesn't really matter what you use, but in this case, I've changed it for things in the future that we're going to be doing. Hit will basically block all. So if you go to right-hand collision and look at it, it was on block all in the past. And block all is fine in this case. I mean, it did what it needed to do. But we don't really want to, as far as animations go and different things like that, we're going to want it to be an overlap. And just see if the fist collides, and then we can perform the right animation. If we do block all, it's going to cause some weird stuff with the physics. At least the way I have planned to set it up. You could probably make it work without issue. So, it's up to you. But I would put it to overlap all, and then I would go down and do on component begin overlap and hit the plus. And you can see I just moved on component hit right up above it. Since I'm not using it, I'm going to delete this, but I wanted to show you. We were using it in the past. If you want to keep using it, it's not really a problem. We're not going to change anything with it today. Just something I thought would be cleaner for the future. All right, so let's look at our new function now that we've taken out everything. We have on component begin overlap with the right hand collision component. We cast to make sure it's an enemy. We check if we've used attack 1. This was previously what I called has punched. I've renamed it, and I'll show you that in a second in the code. And only if we don't have a current weapon or a weapon equipped, then we want to take the strength value of our character, multiply by 0.2, that's just our modifier, and then we want to deal that damage to the enemy. There's something else I've done at the end of this. So before, we were resetting our Boolean, has punched. Well, why would we do that? Right, honestly, it made sense in the moment because we were just trying to make it so that we didn't instantly kill our opponent when we collided with them. But in the larger scheme of things, it was a bit silly. Really what we want to do is just disable the collision on the component. If the punch doesn't have collision anymore, it's already done its duty. We can re-enable it when the animation is done. And we don't have to do all this logic to pretend that, oh, you can't hit them if you've already hit and all this stuff. So, I'm going to make this a little bit cleaner since we got rid of that other branch. But there you go. So basically, instead of setting has punch back to false, I just have right hand collision being set to no collision. And the way you do this is when you have a object that has collision, you can drag off and say set collision enabled. Whoops, if you could spell it correctly. And you can choose the collision type. No collision just means there's no collision. So that's what we want. So hopefully that makes sense, and I know that I changed a lot, so I apologize. But I want to move forward in the series in the best way possible. And when I got started, and I've said this on multiple times, when I got started, I kind of was just making things work until we got to like the quest system and toward the end of the inventory. I was just making things work, and I didn't have a solid direction. And now I've written down the direction I want to go, so I've actually planned these episodes out ahead of time. And so I wanted to change some things to make them cleaner for you. So I apologize for the inconvenience, but I'm doing this because it'll make it easier in the future, and we can actually make a proper game instead of duct taping it together. So that's the last thing I wanted to show you, really, but we do have to go over. I did want to show you that I've changed has punch to has use attack 1, just so it can be a little bit more clear. I've also added a boolean in the code to determine when we can attack. Because even if we've disabled collision, we also don't want the player mashing the button over and over again and being able to cancel their own attack and go into it again. I mean, maybe we do want that, but we want to define the logic ourselves. We don't want the game to determine it. So, in third-person tutorial character.h, or whatever your base character is, in the header file, I go down to where I have my variables, and I've changed has punched to has used attack 1. Changed the comment as well. But this is the same variable. So you don't have to change you don't have to change anything that we did logic-wise with has punched. Just change the name, and of course you'll have to change it in the CPP wherever we used it. So I'll cover those really quick too. But I've also added a boolean called can attack. And it's pretty much what it sounds like. It says determines if the character can use any attack at the moment. So we may have states in our game where we don't want to attack. Maybe we got shocked, so we're paralyzed for a second. Maybe we are already in the middle of an attack, so we don't want to cancel out. Different things like that, you know. So can attack is just a nice little safeguard. It's a thing I like to put in pretty much all projects. Can move, can attack, different scenarios. And it will determine what we can actually do at a given moment. So, just to catch you up, can attack, I set to true by default in this case. And then has punched, which is has used attack 1 now, is still false. You don't have to change it. Just make sure you change the name now if you're changing it to match the series. You can leave it as has punched if you want, but really has punched is a bad name. The reason I'm changing it is because this is anytime we use our basic attack. So if we use an attack and we punch, that's because we don't have a weapon. If we then swing our sword, well, we have our sword. So we're not punching. Punching is a weird word. We're just using our first attack. I call it specifically attack 1 because I'm thinking of like a light and a heavy attack with each weapon. Even with the fist, probably. So has used attack 1 is, it's like the light attack. It's the basic attack. That's how I'm envisioning it in my head. Okay, so that's that. Then in your setup player input component, we had this was punch before, and the function name was punch as well. So I've switched it from punch to use first attack. And again, it's what you can expect. Instead of calling it punch, we're calling it use first attack, so it works for all weapons without being confusing. And this bind action I've changed in the project settings from punch as well. It is a pain to rename things when you try and cover it all, but again, I feel like it's the right decision, which is why I'm letting you know. So down here, attack 1. Instead of being punch, I've called it attack 1. It's still bound to the same key for me, which is just the 1 key. Alright. And lastly with this, if we go down to where we are actually triggering the punch, which is that function, whenever we press that key, that function gets called. So when we press 1, use first attack gets called. I check if can attack before setting the boolean to be true. Before we were just setting has punch to be true here. We want to check if we can attack first. Otherwise, again, we can do things that we don't want to do. Perhaps attack in the middle of an already ongoing attack when we don't want that to be the case. Like, maybe if we're dual wielding, sure, you can attack while your other hand is attacking or something. But if you are already in the middle of an attack and you just cancel it and go to it, that might be really broken in terms of the actual functionality or mechanics of the game. So for now, I just add if can attack and set it to be true in there. And that's all the code changes, and that's all the changes of the older stuff that we need to go over. So I apologize for that inconvenience, but now we are on a much better path, especially with this collision stuff that we did right in here. Just disabling the collision on right-hand collision is incredibly important, because doing this means that we know how and when we're going to hurt our opponents. We don't want to just trigger a Boolean if we can hurt them or not. We want to actually disable collision. It's also good for performance to do that. All right. And we can leave this alone. The character is done at this point. This is all the basic stuff that we have in here. Not necessary for today's episode. So base character is done. The assassin anim BP is pretty much done as well. But I did want to give a quick note about these anim notifies. So since we're no longer just setting the Boolean to determine if we can attack or not, we do want to re-enable collision properly when the animation is done. That way we know that we can actually hurt our opponent again when the time is right. And so let's just cover this entire system really quickly and just go over this again. So we have anim notify, start attack. And start attack, so I have two animations. I have punching and reverse punch. And they both have start attack and end attack. I don't actually use end attack right now, but it could be useful. I just use the transition from the attack back to idle. So if you look at this in the state machine, attack 1, back to idle move. If you scroll down, I have this start transition event called attack finished. And then I also have, on the idle move state itself, fully blended state event, return to idle. So fully blended basically means that once it has gone from one state to this state and it's completely in this state, it's not still in the process of blending between the two. And blending is basically when it tries to connect the two animations so that it looks as nice as possible, as opposed to just skipping from one to the other. It does try to kind of combine the two. That way it's a smooth transition. So fully blended means it's just fully in this idle move state. Once it reaches this, I just do return to idle. Okay, so that's where all these come from. Start attack is at the start of the animation. Basically, once I decide the attack is no longer cancelable. You could put it right at the start, the very first frame if you want. I put it 2 frames in. There's really not a reason for that. I just like to leave a little bit of leniency, just in case we want to allow for some things in the future. We can get more into that. But basically, it doesn't really matter. Start attack is just at the start of the attack when you no longer want the player to be able to perform the action. Return to idle is when we fully blend back to idle move, and attack finished is when we go from attack 1 back to idle move. And you don't need both of these necessarily. I do this as a safeguard. Return to idle could come from any state, whereas attack finish specifically comes from attack 1 back to idle. So however you want to handle that is up to you. This stuff I covered in a previous episode, but I can actually do 2 punches based on this integer value that we determined beforehand. And either way, both punches have the same logic, like I said. So just make sure if you have different animations your character can play, that they have all the proper notifies that you need. When we start the attack, I just set can attack to be false. Remember, setting this to be false will make it so in the code, down at the bottom here, can attack will be false, so it won't go into this if statement, so it won't reset this Boolean. This just makes it much cleaner. It doesn't allow us to actually punch again when we don't want to be able to do that, or use our sword again when we don't want to be able to do that. It's just a nice little thing we can have. The other thing is the return to idle and the attack finished. They both go into the same thing right now, and it might change in the future, but at least attack finish will stay this way. Basically, we're going to reset has used attack 1. At this point, the animation is complete for using the attack, so we're good to activate it again. It's no longer going. Because of this and the animation being complete, we also want to reset can attack and make sure that that's true, because we do want to give the player the ability to attack again. Then I've added something on the end here, which is very important for today's episode. So this is new stuff. While we're here, I'll jump over to today's stuff. But just remember, this next part is for today's stuff. Everything going forward is going to be useful for what we're going over today. So if you came here for just the weapon colliders, then we are at that point. All right, so get this in, and then we'll cover the rest of the logic and MVP in a second. All right, what we're going to be going over today that's completely new is the damage collider on our base weapon BP. Now, on the base weapon BP, you can't see much of anything, just because the base weapon is meant to be kind of like this wrapper class. It's the parent class. It's got all the data that we have, but we don't ever really have a base weapon BP. We have the sword or the axe or the dagger. But we want to put it on the base weapon BP. That way we don't have to, apply it to all these. If you look at class settings, they're all children of base weapon BP, as you guys are familiar with. So they inherit the things that the base weapon has. If you add a component, you can go to box collision or sphere collision or whatever collision you want that fits your weapon the most. For example, I do box collision on all of them, but for something like this, the axe, you could technically do a sphere if you wanted. It's not really super helpful in this case, but there are weapons that are better with other shapes, so feel free to make that fit as necessary and put it on the specific blueprint if you need. For me, I'm just going to use box colliders for everything. So if I go to add component, box collision, and add it, it'll get added here. Make sure you drag it over the weapon mesh. It'll say, drop here to attach box to weapon mesh. Now, I've already done this, right? I have my damage collider, so I'm not going to do it. But once you have it here, you can rename it. I called mine damage collider. And you won't notice a difference with the base weapon BP because, again, quite frankly, it just puts the box there. It's the same size as the interaction box, so it's not any different. It doesn't really matter much. We're not really worrying about that right now. There's a few things we do care about. So first of all, the collision presets, make sure you set them to overlap all, and we can generate hit overlap events. And then I've also done on component begin overlap. So I've hit plus here. I'm going to hit view, but you can hit plus. It'll create this for you. And then this is the logic for dealing damage with it. Now, before we do that, let's get it on the other weapons so that we can test it. Make sure you compile and save this. That way the changes are picked up by the children. And you'll have this damage collider. Now, at the very start, it'll look the same where you won't see anything. You can change the scale. Right, I'm going to undo it because I have the values I want. But you can change the scale, location, to make it work wherever you want to go. Now, I decided I don't want the whole sword to deal damage. I want mainly the part that would actually hurt you. Not saying the hilt wouldn't hurt you, but, So, I just put it around the blade. You can see this box right here. All right? It's very important that you put it around the mesh, like I said, that you make a child of the mesh. If you don't make a child of the mesh, when you attach the sword to the mesh, to the character's mesh, or the weapon to the character's mesh, the collision box will actually not follow it. You can get it to follow it by doing some other logic, but really it's not necessary. If you just make the collider a child of the mesh, it'll automatically follow it. Cool. So once you set this up, it's pretty simple. You don't have to change anything on the sword BP or any of the weapons themselves. Once you change in the base weapon BP, just get the size right and do it for all your weapons or all the weapons that you care about right now. I have it on the axe. I just have, I give it a little bit of leniency just to make it feel better, but and then we have the dagger. Again, I missed the handle on purpose. All right, and now once you've had all your weapons with the damage collider, then we just have to actually do the logic to determine if we've collided with it. And it's going to be very similar to the punch logic. So we are just going to essentially do what we were doing in the punch logic, but it's actually less complicated because we don't have to check if we have a weapon or not. This collision is happening on the damage collider on the weapon itself. The short brief version is we have our on component begin overlap, which we just added previously. We drag off of other actor and cast to our base enemy type. Yeah, it doesn't have to be an enemy. If you want to deal damage to NPCs and stuff in your world, then you would say default actor or something like that. You could find default living organism, something like that. For now, we're just going to be doing enemy because we don't have NPCs or anything. But we cast and see if it's default enemy. If it is, then we continue on the logic. We're going to need that later. And we are going to check if the owner of this is a third-person tutorial character. Now, this is important. When we were attaching things in the past in base weapon BP, we were doing all this logic. We were setting, oh no, there's no collision. We're destroying this actor that we dropped. We're attaching this new weapon and attaching it to the socket. At the very end of all this logic, the attach weapon logic, I have this new node. So the rest of this is the same. Same with remove weapon. Don't get confused. I know it's a little small. Everything is the same as I had it in the past, except for the very last node here. So on attach weapon, I've brought down the character reference all the way to the bottom. This is the character reference. This is a new reroute node. I brought it all the way over here. And we were setting the interaction box to have no collision enabled. That way when we picked it up, it wasn't just saying, oh, equip sword the whole time. Because that's not good. You know, you don't want to sit there and you have the weapon equipped and it's telling you you can equip it the whole time. So that's what we were doing last. But something we want to do is set the owner of this weapon. This is important because, yes, we can attach the weapon to ourselves, but it's good to know, and it'll be good to know for things like projectiles too, like bows, arrows. When you attack an enemy, it can just get the owner it can get the owner of the weapon, and then we can determine logic down the line. So it's not going to be super useful for today, but setting this up now will save us a lot of trouble later, because we can just get the owner of the weapon and then perform logic based off of it. So long story short, if you go attach weapon and use the character reference that we brought into it, just get a reroute node all the way over here. At the end of your attach weapon logic, call set owner. Target self is fine because we're setting the base weapon BP, which is self, to be owned by the character reference. So just drag it into your character reference. I'm going to delete this since I already have it, but there you go. That one little node makes a big difference. And now what we can do, instead of checking to see if because you could do it without being an owner, but guess what you'd have to do? You'd have to say, okay, base weapon BP, get attached, get parent attach point, get whatever, like get mesh, get owner of mesh, different things like this. If you just set the owner when you attach it, then we know that we can just check the owner now. The other thing that's useful to this is if the sword is just laying on the ground, like we have loot that we can pick up, let's say, or loot that's hidden somewhere, and an enemy walks into it, you probably don't want them to get damaged. You want to wait till you're actually attacking with it. So you don't want to just collide with it and deal damage. You want to make sure that the character is holding it and also that they're attacking. So by doing that, now we can call get owner, which is as simple as it sounds, get owner. And we cast it to our character type. Like that. I'm just mimicking what I've already done above. And we're going to check our Boolean for if we've used attack 1. Remember I said that's why we changed it off of has punched. And now this is basically anytime we use this first attack button and branch. We want to make sure that we have performed an attack, because if you don't do this, then you can just walk up to your opponent and stab them. And that might be what you want. Like, I'll show you what it looks like. You can literally just walk up to them. Bam. Alright, so that's not what we want in this case. So that's why I make sure that we have used an attack before performing any extra logic. Alright, so I've mimicked what we have above, but I've done a little bit here. It's not entirely necessary, but it is something that could be useful. I mean, it's something that's definitely going to be useful. We just haven't touched on it a lot. We've only touched on it with the punch. But what I do is I take the base damage of the weapon, multiply by the strength value of the character, then multiply that by a static 0.1 to get my full damage, because if I don't, it's going to be super high. And then I call take damage on default enemy. To do this, and we'll do it quickly because it's not really a problem, our tutorial character is here. This is the one that has the strength value. This is the strength attribute of the character itself. So here's the strength value. The base damage comes off of the base weapon BP, so we can get it without dragging off of anything. There is a int multiplied by float, float multiplied by int. It doesn't matter which one you choose. There you go. And then I just do another multiplication, float by float. And I put in 0.1 here. And we call it take damage. Take damage comes off the enemy, which remember we checked to make sure that the actor we were colliding with was a default enemy before doing any of this logic. So you can drag off of that, call it take damage, make sure the target is default enemy, and then drag in the float. And only if it's true do that. There you go. So now I'm going to get rid of all this stuff I did, but should make sense how I've done it now. And like we did it with the punch and the right-hand collision, we want to make sure that the damage collider doesn't just continuously eat away at the enemy's health. You know, if we perform an attack, hit them, and then disable collision, that's all. We don't want to keep hurting them while we're doing it. And we can have different anim notifies or different parts of the animation that can hurt multiple times. We just don't want to do it the entire time that we're fighting with them. That would be bad. That would just, it would instant kill everybody if you're doing a reasonable amount of damage. So we take our damage collider onto the screen and set collision enabled. And then we just set it to no collision. Now that we have our base weapon BP set up and all of our logic for how we are performing that, then we want to go to the anim BP again. And remember, we set this stuff up. And next we were checking if current weapon was valid or not. We have our character reference in the anim BP, so I won't go over this too much. But basically, you just drag and get current weapon. Thought it was there, my bad. Get current weapon. And then you right click on this and you can convert it to a validated get to have the node that I have. And then only if it's valid, we're going to disable the damage collider. Or sorry, we're going to re-enable the damage collider. If it's not valid, meaning we don't have a weapon, then we are going to re-enable the right-hand collision collider. So this is important because if we're unarmed, we still want to re-enable our fists. But if we are armed, we want to re-enable the collision on that weapon. So it matters which one it is. Use the validated get. If it's valid, cast the weapon to the base weapon BP, because right now current weapon, it's something we make in code that is the default weapon class. But we want the base weapon BP so we can get the damage collider from it. So cast it to your base weapon BP, drag off of that, grab your damage collider, set collision enabled, and set it to collision enabled query and physics. There's other things you can do, like you do query only, physics only. For right now, we're going to keep it enabled because I haven't quite decided how I want to handle the collision in terms of like ragdolling and different things like that could come from it. So we might change this in the future, but for now, collision enabled on both is just, it'll work for everything that we do right now, so there's no reason to not do that. And then one very basic thing I wanted to add for you guys is in our equip item prompt, we were saying equip item, even though we really just add the item to our inventory, and it was starting to bug me. So I've changed the prompt that comes up when you go over an item or a piece of equipment and changed the append node. Instead of saying equip item name ? I've changed it to add item name to inventory ? And you probably saw that earlier, but it's just so much neater. Like, it looks terrible to say equip and you're not really equipping that since we've now added the inventory system. So just wanted to fix that up while I had the chance. Also worth noting while we're here, the issue I was having with the sword flickering on and off as we were next to it isn't an issue with the collision system like I thought. The issue was actually with the interaction box being too small. When the character was moving with his animation, he was falling out of the scope. So he was not colliding with it, not colliding with it. That's what gave it that weird look. So we don't have to do anything really to fix that. I just made the interaction box on specific items bigger or move them more to the center. But excellent. So now we can gear up, and we're going to need to adjust our animations so that they match properly with what weapon we have, perhaps what even armor we have, different things like that. So we're going to have to make sure we match everything. We don't actually have support for leggings because we just never implemented it. But now we can gear up to the best of our ability, and we can attack our opponent. And again, we'll need to perform some extra logic. That way we don't have to like turn it weird to actually hit the opponent and kill them. So we'll go over new animations. We will go over dual wielding because I think it is important and it's actually pretty simple to implement. And then we'll go over some more stuff with combat because I want to clean that up. So that's pretty much our general flow for the next few episodes. But that's all I got for you today. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It helps me more than anything else you can do. It just lets me know that you're enjoying the series and that I'm doing a good job. I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers. Thank you guys so much for all the support you've given me. I really appreciate it. I love working on these series, and I can't wait to see where they go. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. Check us out on Twitch. Then you can click the link right here to go to the YouTube archive channel. Check out all the streams we've done with Apex, Sekiro, all the Dark Souls games, really. So all sorts of fun stuff. And we started doing fighting game streams. So if you want to catch up on any of those, and we talk about how we can implement things in fighting games. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.